There is a thin line between love and obsession. Penal Code 646.9 states that stalking is following, harassing, or threatening a person to the point where they fear for their safety or a family member's safety. Some stalkers do not immediately make threats or come in direct contact with their victim. In light of this, some victims do not take the precautions to protect themselves due to underestimating the perpetrator. However, today I want to convince you why stalking should always be taken seriously. My reasons are that stalking in its essence is psychological violence, and it is a precursor to homicide. Stalking is a form of psychological violence because the effect it has on its victims is equivalent to physical violence. According to a 2023 article by psychologist D.D. Hodge, published by the European Journal of Psychotraumatology, stalking victims exhibit symptoms consistent with other trauma victims. The article informs that victims of stalking display a high prevalence of various psychological disorders, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, excessive anxiety, depressive disorders, hypervigilance, somatization, and even depersonalization. The data concludes that the prevalence of at least one psychiatric disorder was significantly higher among victims of stalking versus non-victims. All in all, the symptom levels of stalking are so astronomical that they have been found to be congruent with torture victims and refugees. According to a 2019 article by researcher Brooklyn Bailey and psychologist Matthew Morris, published by the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, being stalked may invoke a fundamental change in schema related to the self, world, and others. The research indicates that this is due to the victim being in a persistent state of hypervigilance. The hypervigilance manifests itself through rumination, catastrophizing, self-blame, and refocusing on planning steps on how to handle the stalking. The preoccupation of these negative cognitions are so overwhelming for victims that by default they enter into the psychologically distressing cage of isolation and become distrusting of others. Stalking is also a recognized precursor to homicide due to the nature of the perpetrator. According to a 2024 article by forensic psychologists Melissa S. DeRoos and Lily Truce, published by the International Journal of Offender Therapy and Comparative Criminology, stalkers with higher cluster B aligned personality attributions were more likely to engage in violent behaviors. These cluster B personalities included antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorder. Despite the variation of these disorders, a commonality was found between all stalkers who fell within the cluster B category: a desire to frighten. According to the data, perpetrators who had this motive were more likely to commit violence. In light of this, fear in this regard should be taken very seriously by police when incidents of stalking are reported. According to a 2024 article published in Homicide Studies by forensic behavioral science researcher Abigail Sheed and colleagues, stalking affects at least 5.3 million Americans annually, meaning that a homicide rate of 1% would equate to over 50,000 homicides a year. The research indicates that when stalkers feel like their nonviolent tactics, such as fear and intimidation, aren't achieving their objectives, they resort to last resort thinking. When the perpetrator is in the state of last resort thinking, they are self-deceived into believing a resolution must be enforced, even if that resolution is lethal violence. The research further informs that offenders who were found to commit homicide showed evidence months prior that they had no regard for the law or morale. Hence, stalking is homicide in slow motion. Today I've presented information to convince you why stalking should always be taken seriously. Stalking is psychological violence, and stalking is a precursor to homicide. And despite the resilience that many victims of stalking show to maneuver around the stalker, this is not a tool for de-escalation. In regard to the personality types associated with stalkers, one cannot simply rely on their own vigilance to detour the effects or outcomes of stalking. Exposure to stalking requires professional intervention, both psychologically and legally. It is vital that victims seek therapy to cope with mid or post-stalking, as the effects can stay with one for a lifetime. Legally, victims should keep a paper trail of time, dates, and places the stalking occurred to present to law enforcement. Creating a paper trail shows a pattern of history that can't easily be dismissed. Taking the initiative to seek therapy and legal action are two powerful forms of self-protection for victims of stalking. If you or someone you know is being stalked, never hesitate to take action. Stalking is an insidious behavior that should never be underestimated and always be taken seriously at the first sign of distress. Thank you.